One demographic indicator that we use when we're thinking about human populations is called TFR. It stands for total fertility rate. And it's basically an estimate of the number of children that each woman in a population will have during her childbearing years. And there's lots of different factors that influence the total fertility rate in a given population. We'll just mention some of those. The age of a woman's first child is really important. When women delay childbirth to later on in their reproductive years, that tends to decrease total fertility rate because it reduces the window in which women have children. The more educational opportunities that are available to girls and women in a given population has a significant effect. We can see this graph on the left shows for different countries the total fertility rate plotted against the percent of girls enrolled in secondary school. And clearly, the more girls that are enrolled in secondary school, there's a very tight correlation here, the lower the total fertility rate. Access to family planning, that includes things like birth control, family planning, education, sex education, access to those sorts of healthcare and family planning resources decreases total fertility rate. Government policies that encourage or discourage having children can influence total fertility rate, as well as access to healthcare. Here's a graph of the U.S. total fertility rate over the last, 90 years or so. We can see this peak is the baby boom, the post-war baby boom, when total fertility rate went very high and has since declined and is under replacement level fertility in the United States right now. If we look at various countries, the TFR varies widely in different areas, different countries. Some countries have a relatively low total fertility rate. Okay, we could see these blue colors that we see here. Much of Europe and some parts of North America have lower total fertility rates. And some parts of the world have quite high total fertility rates. We see parts of Central Africa and Southeast Asia. They have a higher total fertility rate. And we'll be talking at the end of this unit about the demographic transition model, which predicts what happens to population growth of countries as they go through economic development. And so typically what the patterns are is that less developed, developing nations typically have higher total fertility rates and faster population growth, whereas more developed nations typically have a lower total fertility rate and slower or even negative population growth. So here we see a graph that shows TFR in different time periods, but broken out in different categories. So we have, for the entire world, we can see an overall decline in total fertility rate from the 1950s to predicted for the future. If we break that out by areas of the world, we see that Africa started with the highest total fertility rate and has also declined. We could see the more developed regions like Europe and North America started in the 1950s much lower and have dropped slightly. And we could see the other parts of the world here. And so again, this has close ties to economic development as well, which we'll be talking about. And there's a term that's called replacement level fertility. This is the total fertility rate which would maintain a stable population size. So we typically think about the replacement level fertility in most countries as 2.1, that each couple has 2 children which replace themselves over time, and the 0.1 is a factor that represents, infant mortality and things like that. So 2.1 is typically considered replacement level fertility. It would maintain a stable population size in a given country. If we look at this graph of 10 of the largest countries, this is a little bit dated, but we can see that some countries, some of the largest countries, like China, the US, Brazil, Russia, Japan, are below replacement rate. which means we would expect their population size to be declining. Other nations are above replacement level fertility, and those are countries we would expect to have a growing population. Infant mortality is another important factor to consider when we're thinking about total fertility rate and population growth. Infant mortality varies drastically both around the world, but also within given countries. It depends on things like access to health care and nutrition. Environmental pollution can also be a factor. And so this represents areas of the world with the green colors represent lower levels of infant mortality, and the reddish colors represent higher levels of infant mortality. And what you could also see is that it often tracks economic development and it tracks total fertility rate as well. Countries where there's high infant mortality, typically families compensate for that factor and have more children. It even varies within countries, and this data comes from a paper that looks at infant mortality rates in different U.S. populations. Okay, and we can see here the infant mortality rate on the y-axis, and then we can see some demographic groups on the x-axis, and there are racial disparities clearly. So if we look at the white non-Hispanic infant mortality rates, they're over here and have declined slightly here. We can see that black non-Hispanic racial groupings have much higher levels of infant mortality, and we can see how that varies from group to group. And this is because of very complex factors related to the history of different racial and ethnic groups in the United States. It has relationships to redlining and access to health care and green spaces and healthy foods. It has to do with systemic racism and other factors that all conspire to create these disparities in many ways, but also, like we're talking about today, in terms of infant mortality rates.